This is a violation, Mr. Hayes, and violations have consequences. The words dripping with a venomous and self-satisfied authority hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and suffocating. I stood on my own lawn, a place I had bled for in deserts halfway around the world, and watched as a woman named Karen, the president of our homeowners association, hefted a claw hammer with a grunt that spoke of both effort and immense pleasure. She was a woman built like a brick retaining wall, all solid mass and immovable certainty, her floral muumuu a garish splash of color against the neat, orderly backdrop of our suburban neighborhood. The hammer, a tool of creation in the right hands, became a weapon of pure malice in hers. The first strike wasn't just loud, it was a detonation of sound that ripped through the quiet symphony of lawnmowers and distant children's laughter. The pane of tempered, imported German glass, the centerpiece of my wife's dream greenhouse, didn't just crack, it exploded. A spider web of fractures bloomed in a millisecond before the entire 6 by 8 foot panel disintegrated into a shower of 1,000 glittering, pebble-like cubes. It sounded like a waterfall of diamonds crashing onto the flagstone floor, a beautiful, horrifying sound of $58,000 turning into a pile of useless, sparkling debris. She hit another one, and then another, her face flushed with a terrifying, righteous glee. The rhythmic thud and shatter, a percussive beat to her declaration of war. My own hands, trained to assemble and disassemble complex machinery under fire, clenched into useless fists at my sides. Every instinct, honed over 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, screamed at me to intervene, to disarm, to neutralize the threat. But I was on a different battlefield now, one governed by bylaws and civil litigation, where the wrong move could cost me everything. So I just stood there, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest, and watched her destroy the one thing that had brought my wife, Elena, a sliver of peace after a year of hell. The greenhouse wasn't just a structure, it was our sanctuary, our recovery room, our testament to the future. And this woman was tearing it apart with a $10 hammer and a 50-cent power trip. The last pane shattered, and she tossed the hammer onto my prize-winning petunias with a clatter of finality, wiping a single bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. She looked at me, her eyes small and triumphant in her fleshy face, and gave a curt, satisfied nod as if she'd just finished a particularly strenuous but necessary bit of civic pruning. She had won, for now. But as I looked at the wreckage, at the glittering carpet of ruined glass, and the gaping holes in the beautiful aluminum frame, I felt something shift inside me. The shock cooled into a glacial calm. The anger solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. She had just declared war on the wrong soldier. If you've ever had your own HOA nightmare, you know the feeling of helpless rage I'm talking about. Do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, drop a comment down below and tell me where you're watching from or share your own story. You are not alone in this fight. Now let me tell you how I took a page from the combat engineer's playbook and didn't just fight back. I dismantled her entire empire, piece by bureaucratic piece. This whole nightmare began with a dream. Not mine, but my wife's. Elena is a botanist, a woman who can see the soul of the world in the unfurling of a single leaf. For years, she'd talked about having a proper greenhouse, a glass sanctuary where she could cultivate rare orchids and temperamental tropicals, a place insulated from the harsh Ohio winters. After her battle with a particularly aggressive form of cancer, a fight that left her physically drained and emotionally scarred, that dream became a necessity. It was her therapy, her path back to the living world. We found the perfect property in what seemed like the perfect neighborhood. Northwood Estates, a community of immaculate lawns and stately brick homes. The HOA, at first glance, seemed like a good thing. A promise of maintained property values and a certain standard of living. I'm a man who appreciates order and standards. Before we even closed on the house, I did my due diligence. I obtained a copy of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and Rs, a document thicker than a phone book and written in a language designed to induce comas. I read every single word. Section 7, Article 4, Paragraph B specifically covered outbuildings and ancillary structures. It was dense but clear, Any structure over 100 square feet required a detailed plan submission and approval from the Architectural Review Committee, or ARC, which was chaired by the HOA president. That was Karen. We hired an architect. We didn't just want a functional box. We wanted something beautiful, a structure that would complement the house and the neighborhood. The design was elegant, a Victorian-style conservatory with a high-pitched roof and ornate finials, constructed from a powder-coated aluminum frame. The real expense, the feature Elena was most excited about, was the glass. It was a special tempered glazing imported from a small firm in Germany, designed to diffuse light perfectly and offer superior insulation. It was absurdly expensive, but after watching Elena endure chemo, no price was too high for her happiness. I put together a submission packet that would have made a battalion commander proud. It included architectural blueprints, material specifications, color swatches, a site plan showing its placement well within all setback requirements, and even a 3D rendering showing how it would look from the street. I hand-delivered it to Karen at her home, a slightly too large faux Tudor at the end of the cul-de-sac. She accepted the thick binder with a sniff, her expression one of profound boredom, as if I were handing her a coupon for a free car wash. "The ARC will review this at its next meeting," she stated, not making eye contact, her focus on a daytime television show blaring in her living room. Weeks turned into a month. I followed up with polite emails. Her replies were terse. "Under review." Finally, after 6 weeks, I received a letter. It was a single page, signed by Karen, with the box for approved checked. No comments, no conditions, just a check mark. To me, a man of contracts and clear orders, that was as good as gold. We had our green light. We secured the county building permits, a process that was a cakewalk compared to dealing with the HOA. The foundation was poured, the frame was erected, and then the German glass arrived in massive, carefully packed crates. The installation took a specialized crew 3 days. When they finished, it was breathtaking. The sun streamed through the angled panes, illuminating the empty space with a warm, ethereal glow. Elena walked into it for the first time and burst into tears of joy. She spent the next week moving in her beloved plants, arranging benches, and setting up her potting station. It was her haven. That's when the first notice appeared, taped to our front door. It was a violation letter. "Violation, unapproved structure," it read. "A fine of $50 per day will be assessed until the violation is rectified." I was baffled. I marched down to Karen's house, my approval letter in hand. She opened the door, a smear of what looked like mustard on the collar of her blouse. "There must be a mistake, Karen," I said, holding up the letter. "You approve this." She squinted at the paper, then at me, a slow, smug smile spreading across her face. "Oh, that," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "That was an initial approval of the concept. The final materials and scale are far more ostentatious than the committee envisioned. It's out of character with the neighborhood. It has to come down." My blood ran cold. "The concept? Karen, this letter is an unconditional approval. The plans I submitted detailed every single material, every single dimension. It's all there in the binder I gave you." She just shrugged, the smile never leaving her face. "Binders get lost. Memories are faulty. What I see is a massive glass palace that blocks my view of the sunset. It's a violation." "And violations," she said, her voice dropping to that same venomous tone I would hear again later, "have consequences." That was 2 weeks before the day she showed up with the hammer. 2 weeks of daily fines, of increasingly threatening letters, of me trying to reason with an unreasonable tyrant. I had scheduled a meeting with my lawyer for the following day. I should have done it sooner. I learned that day that in a war with a petty dictator, you can't afford to wait. You have to strike first because their first strike will always be aimed at the one thing you can't bear to lose. The sound of the police siren was a welcome but ultimately hollow note in the aftermath of the destruction. 2 officers from the local sheriff's department arrived, a young, earnest-looking deputy and an older, more world-weary sergeant. They surveyed the scene, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and procedural caution. The glittering sea of shattered glass covering the flagstones, the gaping wounds in the greenhouse frame, the smug, unrepentant figure of Karen standing amidst my wife's trampled petunias. It was a tableau of suburban madness. "Ma'am, did you do this?" the sergeant asked, his voice carefully neutral as he gestured toward the wreckage. Karen, to my astonishment, puffed out her chest. "I did, officer," she declared, as if admitting to a heroic act. "I am Karen Miller, president of the Northwood Estates Homeowners Association. This structure is a gross violation of our community bylaws. The owner, Mr. Hayes, was notified repeatedly and refused to comply. I was acting under the authority of the HOA board to enforce the removal of the unapproved structure." She produced a piece of paper from the pocket of her muumuu with a flourish. "This is the emergency abatement order, signed by the board." The sergeant took the paper and examined it. I could see from his frown that something was off. I stepped forward, my voice tight but level. "Sergeant, that's a lie. My name is Mark Hayes. I am the homeowner. I have a signed approval for this structure from Ms. Miller herself. She's been harassing me for weeks with bogus fines, and now she has come onto my property and criminally destroyed over $50,000 worth of property." I had my phone in my hand, already displaying the photo of the approval letter. The sergeant looked from her order to my phone, then back at the devastation. The young deputy was looking at Karen with wide, incredulous eyes. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, his voice hardening slightly, "this order isn't a court document. It's a letter signed by you and 2 other people. You can't just go onto someone's property and destroy it with a hammer, HOA or not. This is vandalism. Criminal destruction of property." Karen's smugness faltered for a fraction of a second. "It's in the bylaws," she insisted. "The board has the right to abate nuisances and correct violations. He was creating a nuisance." That's when Elena appeared. She had been inside napping, and the sirens had woken her. She walked out onto the patio, saw the greenhouse, and a sound escaped her lips that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a small, wounded gasp, the sound of hope being extinguished. She swayed on her feet, and I rushed to her side, wrapping my arm around her. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking as fragile as she had in the darkest days of her treatment. Seeing her, the officer's demeanor shifted. This was no longer just a property dispute. Karen, however, was unmoved. "Oh, the theatrics," she scoffed. "It's just a building." The sergeant shot her a look that could have curdled milk. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right here." He turned to me. "Mr. Hayes, I understand you want her arrested right now, but given her claim of acting on behalf of the HOA, this is going to get messy. It's a civil matter that has now crossed into a criminal one. The DA will likely want to see a full report before deciding on charges. What I can do right now is take a full report, document everything, and I am strongly advising you to file for a restraining order first thing in the morning." It wasn't the immediate justice I craved, but I knew he was right. This wasn't a simple bar fight. This was calculated warfare, and I needed to use the right weapons. While the deputies took statements and photographed the scene, I made the first of many crucial calls. I called my insurance company and started the claim, carefully describing the incident as malicious vandalism by a known individual. Then I called David Chen. David had been a JAG officer in the Army before going into private practice. We'd served together in Iraq. He was sharp, relentless, and understood the importance of strategy. I explained the situation, my voice a low, controlled monotone. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Mark," he said, his voice grim, "don't touch a thing. Don't clean up a single piece of glass. Let the police finish, then I want you to take more photos. Hundreds of them, from every angle. Close-ups of the glass, the hammer, the trampled flowers. Get video. Walk the perimeter. Document everything as if you're preparing an after-action report for CENTCOM. This isn't just about the money anymore. This is about punitive damages. We're not just going to make her pay for the glass. We're going to dismantle her." His words were a balm to my frayed nerves. He gave me a mission. As the deputies finally left, handing me a case number, I got to work. I put on a pair of work boots and gloves and began my documentation. I collected the hammer she'd used, placing it carefully in an evidence bag David told me to use. I took a sample of the shattered glass, and then I did something else. I walked across the street and started documenting Karen's own property. A rusty basketball hoop with a torn net, explicitly forbidden by the bylaws. A garish pink flamingo, also forbidden. A patch of lawn where the grass was over 6 inches high. A small crack in her driveway. I photographed and logged every single one. It was petty, yes, but David's words echoed in my head. This was war, and in war you gather intelligence on your enemy's weaknesses. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the glittering ruins of my wife's dream, I felt the last vestiges of the suburban homeowner fall away, replaced by the cold, methodical focus of the combat engineer. Karen Miller had knocked down my structure. I was going to knock down hers, and mine was going to be a hell of a lot bigger than a greenhouse. The morning after the demolition brought no relief, only a fresh wave of institutional absurdity. Taped to my front door, right next to the spot where the first bogus violation notice had been, was a new letter from the HOA. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it from the wood. It was an official notice of violation, complete with the HOA letterhead. But this one wasn't for the greenhouse. It was for failure to maintain property in a clean and orderly condition, citing the vast expanse of shattered glass on my patio. Appended to it was a fine, a one-time cleanup penalty of $500, plus a continuing fine of $100 per day until the debris was removed. The sheer unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. Karen had destroyed my property, and now her rubber stamp board was fining me for the mess she had made. It was like being billed for the bullet. I felt a surge of white-hot fury, so intense it made my vision swim. I wanted to storm down to her house, pound on her door, and scream until my lungs gave out. But David's voice echoed in my mind. Document everything. I took a photo of the new notice, carefully capturing the date and time. I filed it away in a new folder I had labeled Karen Evidence. This folder was rapidly becoming the primary focus of my existence. My next stop was the county courthouse to file for a temporary restraining order against Karen. The process was straightforward, and the clerk, seeing the photos I'd brought, expedited the paperwork. By noon, I had a signed order from a judge, legally prohibiting Karen from setting foot on my property or contacting me or Elena in any way. A sheriff's deputy would serve her the papers that afternoon. It was a small but necessary victory. That evening was the monthly HOA board meeting held in the clubhouse of the community pool. Originally, I had no intention of going. What was the point? But David had been insistent. You have to go, Mark. You have to put your case on the official record. Don't expect to win. Expect to be ambushed. This isn't about convincing them. It's about getting their reaction on the record. It's discovery. So I went. Elena stayed home. She couldn't bear to be in the same room as that woman. I walked into the clubhouse and the chatter immediately died down. About 30 residents were there, most of them looking at me with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. At the front of the room, behind a folding table, sat Karen and her two bored cronies, a nervous, bird-like woman named Carol and a beefy, silent man named Bob, who seemed to be her personal enforcement unit. Karen called the meeting to order, her voice booming with false cheerfulness. They went through the minutes, the treasurer's report, and a long, boring discussion about the petunia color scheme for the front entrance. Then she came to new business. As many of you are aware, she began, her eyes sweeping the room before landing on me, there was an unfortunate incident this week involving the necessary abatement of an unapproved and frankly hazardous structure at 112 Oak Street. A murmur went through the crowd. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice dripping with condescension, was repeatedly warned that his enormous glass palace was not in compliance. He chose to ignore these warnings. The board, acting on its fiduciary duty to protect property values and enforce the covenants, had no choice but to take decisive action. I stood up. That is a complete fabrication, I said, my voice ringing out in the suddenly silent room. I have here, I held up the file, a copy of the approval for my greenhouse, signed by Miss Miller herself. I also have a police report for the criminal destruction of my property and a restraining order issued against her this morning. I started to walk forward to place the documents on the table. You are out of order, Mr. Hayes, Karen barked, her face turning a blotchy red. This is not a courtroom. Your so-called evidence is inadmissible. You are not on the agenda. I want to make a formal statement for the record, I insisted, my voice steady. You came onto my property and— Security, Karen shrieked, looking at Bob. Mr. Hayes is being disruptive and threatening. Remove him. Bob, who had been sitting there like a garden gnome, lumbered to his feet. He was big but slow. I had dealt with bigger and faster. I didn't move. I looked him in the eye. Don't touch me, I said, my voice low and calm. The room was thick with tension. People were starting to pull out their phones. A man in the front row, a neighbor named Frank, who I knew was a retired cop, spoke up. Now hold on, Karen. Let the man speak. This is a community meeting, not a dictatorship. A few other people murmured in agreement. Karen's eyes darted around the room, realizing she was losing control of the narrative. She slammed her plastic gavel down on the table. This matter is closed. We are moving on. If you don't sit down, Mr. Hayes, I will have you fined for disorderly conduct. I stood there for a moment longer, letting my defiance hang in the air. I had made my point. I hadn't come to win a debate. I'd come to draw a line in the sand and get their official, hostile reaction on the record. I had it. I slowly sat back down, my eyes locked on Karen's. The rest of the meeting was a blur. She had successfully intimidated the room back into silence. But the seed of doubt had been planted. People kept glancing at me, then at her, their expressions uneasy. As the meeting adjourned, several people approached me, not in the open, but quietly as they were heading for the door. That was awful, one woman whispered. We saw the greenhouse. It was beautiful. Another man slipped me a piece of paper. My name's George. I'm a retired CPA. Her numbers have never added up. If you're going to fight her, you might want to look at the money. I took the paper. George, the retired CPA. This was a new front. As I walked home through the quiet, lamplit streets, I realized David was right. The meeting wasn't a defeat. It was the beginning of my counteroffensive. Karen thought she could control the story by controlling the room, but the story was already escaping, slipping through the cracks of her crumbling authority. One whispered conversation, one slip of paper at a time. The war was just beginning, and I was starting to recruit my army. The piece of paper from George, the retired CPA, felt heavier than its physical weight. It was a key, a potential new weapon in a war that was, until now, being fought on Karen's terms. His note was simple. Her budget reports are a work of fiction. Look at the landscaping and legal line items. Call me. The next morning I called him. George had a quiet, methodical voice, the kind you'd expect from a man who spent 40 years chasing decimal points. Mr. Hayes, George Peterson here. I'm sorry about what happened to your property. I've lived here for 15 years and I've never seen anything like it, but I'm not surprised. He explained that for years, he'd had a suspicion that Karen was mismanaging the HOA funds. As a former accountant, he had a habit of reading financial statements for fun. Every year, he said, the budget for landscaping and grounds maintenance goes up by 20%, even when we haven't added any new common areas. It's now over $100,000 a year. For what? Mowing the little patch of grass at the front entrance? And the legal and administrative fees are astronomical. It's like we're a Fortune 500 company in constant litigation. This was the opening I needed. My fight was personal, but a financial scandal was universal. Everyone in the neighborhood paid HOA dues. If Karen was stealing from them, my personal grievance would become a community-wide crusade. This was the fulcrum on which we could pivot public opinion. David Chen was ecstatic when I told him, "This is it, Mark. This is the flank. We hit her on the property destruction, and we hit the HOA on financial malfeasance. She won't know which fire to put out first." David immediately got to work drafting Freedom of Information Act requests. Even though an HOA is a private corporation, many states have laws that grant homeowners rights similar to FOIA, allowing them to inspect financial records, contracts, and meeting minutes. We didn't just request the budget, we requested every invoice, every contract, and all board communications related to my property, and the two line items George had flagged, landscaping and legal. The HOA's bylaws, which Karen so loved to weaponize, required them to comply within 30 days. While we waited for the bureaucratic gears to turn, I started my own investigation. I looked up the green pastures landscaping company that was listed on the budget reports George had given me. A quick search of state business records revealed the owner, one Daniel Miller. A quick social media search confirmed it. Daniel Miller was Karen's brother-in-law. The company was registered to a residential address, had no website, and no reviews. It was a ghost, a shell company designed to funnel HOA money into her family's pockets. The legal firm on retainer, Thompson and Associates, was a similar story. The principal, a lawyer named Stephen Thompson, was Karen's first cousin. His specialty wasn't property law, it was personal injury. It was a blatant case of nepotism and likely kickbacks. But I needed more than just a family connection. I needed to find other victims. David's paralegal, a young, tech-savvy investigator, dug into property records for Northwood Estates. We were looking for people who had sold their homes in the last 5 years under unusual circumstances, quick sales, or after a flurry of HOA violation notices. We found two. The first was a young military family, the Garcias, who had been hounded for the color of their children's swing set. They received daily fines until they finally gave up and moved. The second was an elderly couple, the Martins, who were cited for a non-conforming mailbox that had been there for 20 years. They fought it for a while, but the constant stress and escalating fines were too much for them. They sold the house they had planned to retire in and moved to a condo. I decided to contact them personally. I found the Garcias stationed at a base in Texas. I called the husband, Sergeant Garcia. At first, he was wary. "Man, we're out of there. We don't want any more trouble from that woman." "I understand that, Sergeant," I said, using his rank to build a bridge. "I'm a vet myself, retired Army engineer. She's come after me now. She destroyed my property. I'm not letting it go. Any information you have, any letters, any records of the fines, could help build a case that shows a pattern of abuse. It won't just help me. It could stop her from doing this to anyone else." There was a pause. I could hear him talking to his wife in the background. He came back on the line, his voice harder. "She made my wife cry. She told my kids their swing set was ghetto." "Yeah, okay, I'll help. I kept every damn letter she sent us. I'll scan them and email them to you tonight." One domino had fallen. The Martins were harder to find. They had moved to a retirement community 2 states away and didn't have much of an online presence. But I tracked them down through a public records search. I spoke to Mr. Martin, a man whose voice was frail but full of a quiet dignity. He told me about the mailbox, how it had been a gift from their son. He told me how Karen would stand on the sidewalk and take pictures of it, how she would leave nasty handwritten notes. "We just didn't have the fight in us anymore," he said, his voice thick with sadness. "She took the joy out of our home." "Sir, would you be willing to sign an affidavit testifying to that?" I asked gently. "You wouldn't have to come to court, just a written statement." "Yes," he said, his voice suddenly firm. "Yes, I would. That woman is a bully, and bullies need to be stood up to." By the end of the week, my evidence folder was no longer just a folder. It was a multi-volume epic of petty tyranny. I had the financial breadcrumbs from George, the pattern of abuse evidence from the Garcias and the Martins, and my own meticulously documented case of criminal destruction. The 30-day deadline for our records request was approaching. Karen could ignore a single homeowner. She could shout me down in a meeting, but she couldn't ignore the combined weight of all these stories. We weren't just fighting for a greenhouse anymore. We were fighting for the Garcias' kids, for the Martins' mailbox, for every person who had been bullied into submission. Karen thought she was the queen of Northwood Estates, ruling from her throne of paper violations. She had no idea we were about to set her paper kingdom on fire. The arrival of the documents from the HOA was not the neatly organized binder I had submitted, but a chaotic dump of paper. 3 large cardboard boxes were left on my porch, filled with loose invoices, crumpled meeting minutes, and reams of printed-out emails all mixed together. It was a classic document dump strategy. Overwhelm your opponent with disorganized information in the hopes they'll miss the smoking gun. They underestimated my patience. I was a man who had spent weeks at a time in a desert tent, meticulously planning logistical routes. Sifting through paperwork was a vacation. I converted my dining room into a war room. I bought a high-speed scanner and several colors of highlighters. George, the retired CPA, came over with a box of donuts and a ledger pad, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. Maria, a young woman who lived down the street and worked in data analytics, heard what we were doing and volunteered to help. "I can build a database," she offered. "We can cross-reference dates, names, and payment amounts. Find the patterns." Our small alliance was growing, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous indignation. For the next week, we worked. We scanned every single piece of paper. Maria built a searchable database. George focused on the invoices from Green Pastures, Landscaping, and Thompson and Associates. I focused on the board meeting minutes and emails, looking for any mention of my property or other targeted homeowners. The patterns emerged quickly, and they were uglier than we had imagined. George's discovery was the most damning. The invoices from Karen's brother-in-law's landscaping company were a joke. They were written in Microsoft Word, with no letterhead, and charged astronomical amounts for vague services like grounds beautification, $5,000, or seasonal debris removal, $7,500. The dates on the invoices often corresponded with trips Karen and her husband had taken, which we verified through her own self-congratulatory posts on social media. "Look at this," George said, tapping a spreadsheet. "Here's an invoice for $8,000 for emergency storm cleanup from a storm that never happened. And here," he pointed to his laptop, "is a photo Karen posted that same week from a cruise ship in the Caribbean. They weren't cleaning up branches. They were funding their vacation with our dues. The legal fees were just as bad. Her cousin's firm was billing the HOA an average of $10,000 a month. The invoices listed vague consultations, bylaw review, compliance strategy. We cross-referenced the dates with the violation letters sent to me, the Garcias, and the Martins. It was clear Karen was using our money to pay her cousin to advise her on how to legally harass us. It was a self-sustaining cycle of corruption. Meanwhile, I found the minutes from the ARC meeting where my greenhouse was supposedly discussed. The entry was just one line: 112 Oak Street proposal reviewed. Concept approved pending final review. This directly contradicted the unconditional approval letter she had sent me. More importantly, I found an email chain between Karen and the other two board members, Carol and Bob. It was from the day after she approved my plan. Carol had written, "Karen, are you sure about the greenhouse? It looks very large on the plans." Karen's reply was chilling. "Let him build it. It's easier to get rid of a structure that's already there than to fight about it on paper. Once it's up, we can declare it a violation of neighborhood character. He'll have no choice but to tear it down. The precedent is important." It was a premeditated trap. She had planned to let me spend all that money just so she could force me to tear it down as a show of power. This email was the smoking gun. It proved intent. It proved conspiracy. Armed with this mountain of evidence, it was time to move from defense to offense. I started talking to my neighbors, not in hushed whispers anymore, but directly. I invited small groups of them to my house, not to the war room in the dining room, but to the living room. I calmly and methodically laid out the case. I showed them the landscaping invoices next to Karen's vacation photos. I showed them the legal bills. I showed them the email proving she had intentionally trapped me. I showed them the sworn affidavits from the Garcia and Martin families. The reactions were visceral. There was shock, then anger. People who had been afraid to speak up before were now furious. The money was the key. They might not have cared about my greenhouse, but they cared about being robbed. Frank, the retired cop, was incensed. "This is fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. This isn't just an HOA dispute, it's a criminal enterprise." We formed a Concerned Homeowners of Northwood Estates committee. Frank, George, Maria, and I were the unofficial steering group. Our first goal was to formally demand an independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances. Our bylaws, the very document Karen wielded like a club, had a provision for it. If 20% of homeowners signed a petition, the board was required to hire an outside auditing firm. Maria created a simple, professional-looking petition. We divided the neighborhood into sections. For 3 days, we went door to door. It wasn't a hard sell. By the time we showed people the evidence, they were eager to sign. We didn't just get 20%, we got over 70%. More than 2/3 of the neighborhood signed on. We were no longer a few disgruntled residents. We were the overwhelming majority. We were the community. The stage was being set for a confrontation Karen couldn't control, one she couldn't shout down or rule out of order. Her power was derived from the residents' apathy and fear. We were about to show her what happened when that apathy turned to anger, and that fear turned to resolve. The petition was ready. The evidence was compiled. The trap was about to be sprung. The next move had to be precise and overwhelming, a combined arms assault on both the legal and community fronts. David Chen filed the lawsuit. It wasn't a small claims action. It was a sprawling, multi-count civil complaint filed in the county's Court of Common Pleas. It named Karen Miller, personally, as the first defendant. This was David's masterstroke. By providing evidence of criminal action, the destruction of property, and actions far outside the scope of her duties, the conspiracy to entrap me, we could pierce the corporate veil of the HOA. This meant she couldn't hide behind the HOA's liability insurance for everything. Her personal assets, her house, her savings, her cruise-funded retirement account, were now on the line. The lawsuit also named the HOA itself and the other two board members, Carol and Bob, as co-defendants. The counts were numerous: destruction of private property, trespass, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a request for a court-ordered dissolution of the current board. The damages we sought were specific: $58,000 for the replacement of the greenhouse, plus the costs of the daily fines she had illegally levied, plus David's legal fees. And then there was the final item: punitive damages. We asked for $500,000. David's reasoning was simple. We're not just asking for compensation. We're asking the court to punish her, to make an example of her, so that no HOA president in this state ever thinks they can appoint themselves judge, jury, and executioner again. A process server, a big ex-Marine with a neck like a tree trunk, delivered the summons. He served Karen first, at her home. According to his report, she took the thick packet of legal documents, glanced at the first page, and laughed. "This is frivolous," she allegedly said. "Our HOA lawyer will have this thrown out in a week." She was still high on her own supply of perceived power, completely oblivious to the fact that her HOA lawyer, her cousin Stephen, was about to be named in a bar association complaint for malpractice and conspiracy. The server then delivered the summons to Carol at her home and Bob at his workplace. The reports on them were different. Carol reportedly turned pale and started trembling. Bob just grunted and signed for it. The seeds of dissent were being sown within her own ranks. The very next day, our committee formally submitted the petition for the forensic audit to the HOA board, as per the bylaws. We didn't just drop it off. Frank, George, and I delivered it to Karen personally, with Maria recording the interaction on her phone from a discreet distance. We found Karen getting out of her car in her driveway, her arms full of grocery bags. "Karen," Frank said, his voice polite but firm, "on behalf of the homeowners of Northwood Estates, we are formally submitting this petition." He handed her the thick stack of papers, over 200 signatures in total. She juggled her groceries, her face clouding over as she recognized the document. "This is a petition signed by over 70% of the residents, demanding a full, independent forensic audit of the association's finances, as required by Article 9, Section 4 of the bylaws." Karen dropped a bag of groceries. A carton of eggs smashed on the driveway. "This is harassment," she sputtered, her face turning crimson. "You're all in on this with him." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is his fault." "No, Karen," George said quietly, stepping forward. "This is your fault. The numbers don't add up. We want to know where our money has been going." She was cornered. The lawsuit was a direct attack on her. The audit was an attack on her power base and her personal slush fund. Her reaction was exactly what we predicted. She panicked. And when a tyrant panics, they don't retreat. They double down. 2 days later, every homeowner in Northwood Estates received an urgent notice for a special emergency meeting. The purpose, the notice stated, was to discuss unforeseen legal challenges and to vote on a one-time special assessment to protect the financial solvency of our community. The notice was filled with inflammatory language, blaming a litigious resident, me, for bringing frivolous lawsuits that threatened to bankrupt the HOA. The proposed special assessment was a staggering $2,000 per household. Her plan was transparently desperate. She would use our own money to hire a top-flight law firm to defend her against the lawsuit we had filed, and she would simultaneously turn the entire neighborhood against me by blaming me for the cost. It was a bold, reckless move, and it was going to be her undoing. Maria immediately sent out a mass email to our growing list of supporters. "Do not panic," it read. "This is the move of a desperate person. Attend the meeting. We will be prepared. The truth will come out." David Chen confirmed he would be at the meeting, not to speak, but to sit in the front row as my legal counsel, a silent, imposing reminder that this was no longer an amateur shouting match. The special meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday. The battlefield was chosen. The community was the audience. Karen thought she was walking into a public execution where I was the guest of honor. She had no idea she was the one walking toward the gallows. The trap she had set for me had failed, and now she had stumbled headlong into ours. The atmosphere in the clubhouse on the night of the special meeting was electric. It wasn't the usual sleepy gathering of a dozen or so residents. It was standing room only. Over 100 homeowners had packed into the room, their faces a mixture of anger, anxiety, and grim determination. They weren't there for the free cookies and weak coffee. They were there for a reckoning. Karen and her two board disciples, Carol and Bob, sat at the front table, looking visibly shaken by the turnout. Karen, however, quickly regained her composure, wrapping herself in a mantle of embattled authority. She banged her gavel, the sound sharp and brittle in the tense silence. "This special meeting is now in session," she announced, her voice straining to sound commanding. "As you know from the notice, our community is facing an unprecedented legal threat from a single resident who seeks to enrich himself at the expense of us all." She glared directly at me, where I sat in the front row with David Chen beside me. "This frivolous and malicious lawsuit threatens our financial stability. To defend our community, the board has consulted with legal experts. The cost will be significant. Therefore, we are proposing a one-time special assessment of $2,000 per household to fund our legal defense and protect our property values." A wave of angry murmurs swept through the room. A man in the back shouted, "$2,000? You've got to be kidding me." Karen banged the gavel again. "This is not a debate. It is a necessity. We must show a united front against this attack. We will now vote on the assessment. All in favor?" "Point of order!" A loud, clear voice cut through her attempt to railroad the vote. It was Frank, the retired cop. He was standing near the back, his arms crossed. "According to the bylaws, Article 5, Section 2, any special assessment requires a full presentation of the necessity and a period for homeowner discussion before a vote can be called. You have not allowed for discussion." Karen's face tightened. She had been outmaneuvered with her own rulebook. "Fine," she snapped. "Is there any discussion?" That was the opening we needed. George Peterson, the retired CPA, stood up. He held a small stack of printouts. "I have a discussion point," he said calmly. "I'd like to discuss the current state of our finances, which is why we're supposedly in this mess." Before Karen could object, Maria, who had quietly set up a projector and screen at the side of the room, hit a button on her laptop. The first slide flashed onto the screen. It was a copy of an invoice from Green Pastures Landscaping for $7,500 for seasonal debris removal. "This invoice," George said, his voice amplified by a small portable microphone he'd brought, "is from last October. Now, Maria, could you bring up the next slide?" The screen changed to a photo collage. Karen and her husband, beaming on the deck of a cruise ship, with a date stamp from the exact same week. The crowd gasped. "This is just one of dozens of examples," George continued, as Maria clicked through more slides showing suspicious invoices next to social media posts of vacations and expensive purchases. "Our landscaping budget has been inflated to fund the Miller family's lifestyle. Our legal budget has been used to pay Karen's cousin to harass residents. We are not in a financial crisis because of Mr. Hayes' lawsuit. We are in a crisis because our HOA president has been treating our treasury like her personal piggy bank." The room erupted. People were shouting, pointing at Karen, their anger palpable. Karen was on her feet screaming, "Lies! These are doctored! This is a smear campaign!" It's all from the documents you provided, George said coolly. Frank stood up again. And as for the unfortunate incident that started this, he said, his voice booming over the chaos, destroying a man's property with a hammer isn't abating a nuisance. I was a police officer for 30 years. That's a felony. It's called criminal mischief. And in this case, given the value, it could mean jail time. Then it was my turn. I stood up. David placed a hand on my arm, a silent signal of support. I didn't want any of this, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden lull as people turned to listen. I just wanted to build a greenhouse for my wife. I followed every rule. I got approval. I held up the letter. This is the approval Karen signed. Then I got this. I held up the printout of her email. This is an email from Karen to the board, proving she planned to let me build it just so she could tear it down. She never had any intention of honoring her own approval. The silence was absolute. The betrayal was so blatant, so malicious that no one could deny it. I turned to Maria. And one more thing. The final piece of our presentation flashed on the screen. It was video. Crystal clear, high-definition video from the new security camera I had installed, pointing directly at the greenhouse. The footage began. It showed Karen marching onto my property, hammer in hand. It captured her venomous words. This is a violation, Mr. Hayes, and violations have consequences. It showed every single swing, every explosion of glass. The audio was perfect. The entire room watched, mesmerized and horrified, as their HOA president, in a fit of rage, single-handedly destroyed $58,000 worth of property. When the video ended, no one spoke. The only sound was a choked sob from the front table. It was Carol, the mousy board member. Her face was buried in her hands. Karen stood frozen, her face ashen. The smugness, the authority, the righteous indignation, it had all been stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, exposed fraud. A news camera light suddenly switched on in the back of the room. Maria had tipped off a local investigative reporter. They had caught the whole thing. The vote on the special assessment was never called. Instead, a homeowner stood up and made a new motion. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence and the recall of the entire board of directors. Another homeowner seconded it instantly. The revolution had begun. The vote to recall Karen and her board was not just a vote, it was an exorcism. Hands shot up all over the room, a forest of unified outrage. Frank, acting as an impromptu moderator, counted them out loud. The result was nearly unanimous. Karen, Carol, and Bob were stripped of their titles and their power in a public spectacle of their own making. Karen didn't even try to fight it. She just stood there, swaying slightly, her face a mask of disbelief as the community she had ruled with an iron fist dismantled her reign in less than 5 minutes. The news reporter, a sharp young woman named Sarah, moved in for the kill, her cameraman right behind her. "Ms. Miller," Sarah said, microphone extended, "do you have any comment on the evidence presented tonight? The allegations of embezzlement? The video of you destroying Mr. Hayes' property?" Karen stared at her blankly, then turned and tried to push her way through the crowd, which parted before her not with respect, but with contempt. She fled the clubhouse, her reign ending not with a bang, but with a humiliating retreat into the darkness. The immediate aftermath of the meeting was a flurry of organized activity. An interim board was elected on the spot, with George Peterson as treasurer, Frank as president, and Maria as secretary. Their first official act was to unanimously pass a motion to hire an independent forensic auditing firm, as demanded by the petition. Their second act was to issue a formal, public apology to me and my wife, which was captured by the news camera. Their third act was to authorize the HOA's actual, legitimate insurance policy to begin settlement talks with my lawyer, David Chen. The power structure of Northwood Estates had been completely inverted in the course of a single evening. The news story aired on the 10 o'clock broadcast. It was devastating. The reporter laid out the entire narrative. The veteran, the sick wife, the dream greenhouse, the tyrannical HOA president, the destruction, the financial scandal, and the dramatic community meeting. They showed clips of the security camera footage, of George's presentation, and of Karen's panicked flight from the clubhouse. My phone started ringing off the hook with calls from other local and even national news outlets. Story had gone viral. Suburban HOA, President's Reign of Terror. Ends in public takedown. One headline read, "The public exposure was a force multiplier." The day after the news report aired, the district attorney's office called David Chen. They had seen the report in the undeniable video evidence. They were opening a criminal investigation into Karen Miller for felony criminal mischief. Furthermore, based on the evidence of financial wrongdoing, they were opening a second, broader investigation into potential embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy charges against Karen and any co-conspirators. The legal walls were closing in on her from all sides. My civil lawsuit proceeded with lightning speed. Faced with the video evidence and the mountain of documentation, the HOA's insurance carrier had no interest in a prolonged court battle. They quickly offered a settlement. David, true to his word, was relentless. He rejected their first two offers. "We're not just accepting the replacement cost," he told them. "We're getting damages for the harassment, the emotional distress, and to punish the gross negligence of the previous board." They settled for a sum that covered the full $58,000 replacement cost of the greenhouse, all my legal fees, the bogus fines I had paid, and a substantial additional amount for punitive damages. The new HOA board, led by Frank, also formally voided all of Karen's previous actions against me and expunged the violations from my record. The criminal case against Karen moved forward. Faced with the prospect of a public trial where the video would be the star witness, she crumbled. Her cousin, the lawyer, had dropped her as a client the moment the DA's investigation was announced, fearing his own disbarment. Her new, very expensive criminal defense attorney advised her to take a deal. She pleaded guilty to felony criminal mischief. In exchange for her plea, the DA agreed to hold the more complex fraud and embezzlement charges in abeyance, pending her full cooperation and the results of the forensic audit. The judge was not lenient. He had seen the video. He sentenced her to 5 years of probation, 2,000 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management counseling. And then came the final, crushing blow, the restitution order. The court ordered Karen Miller, personally, to pay back the full $58,000 to the insurance company that had settled my claim. The punitive damages from my civil suit, combined with the restitution order and her own mounting legal bills, financially ruined her. The final symbolic confrontation was quiet and deeply satisfying. A few months later, I was out in my yard, overseeing the construction of the new greenhouse. The new glass, just as beautiful as the first, was being carefully installed. I looked up and saw a moving truck parked in front of Karen's faux Tudor house at the end of the cul-de-sac. A for sale sign was staked in her lawn. She was forced to sell her house to cover her debts. I watched as two movers carried out a large, ornate dining room table, a symbol of so many self-important dinners and holiday celebrations. Karen stood on the porch, directing them, looking smaller and grayer than I had ever seen her. She looked up and our eyes met across the manicured lawns. There was no anger in her expression anymore, no smugness, no power. There was only the hollowed-out look of defeat. She quickly looked away, ashamed. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just gave a slow, deliberate nod and turned back to the work at hand. The battle was over. Justice had been served. It was time to rebuild. The day the last pane of glass was set into the new greenhouse was a beautiful, crisp autumn afternoon. The light filtered through the pristine German glazing, filled the space with a warm, hopeful glow. It was identical in design to the first one, but it felt entirely different. The first was built on a foundation of hope and naivety. This one was built on a foundation of resilience, community, and hard-won justice. It wasn't just my greenhouse anymore. It felt like it belonged to the whole neighborhood. To celebrate, Elaine and I decided to host a greenhouse warming party. We invited everyone, George and his wife, Frank and his family, Maria, and all the other neighbors who had signed the petition, offered words of support, or simply showed up to that fateful meeting. We even invited Sergeant Garcia and his family, who were on leave, and made the drive up from Texas to be there. Our patio, once a crime scene littered with shattered glass, was now filled with tables of food, laughing neighbors, and the sound of children playing on the lawn. Frank, the new HOA president, gave a small informal speech. He stood with a bottle of beer in his hand, his demeanor relaxed and content. "I want to propose a toast," he said, raising the bottle, "to new beginnings and to good neighbors who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right. To Mark and Elena, for their courage and for reminding us what community is really about." Everyone cheered and clinked their glasses and bottles. George came up to me, a plate of barbecue in his hand. "The audit report came in," he said quietly, a grimly satisfied smile on his face. "It's worse than we thought. Over $250,000 unaccounted for over the last 6 years. The DA has it now. She's not going to escape the fraud charges after all." I nodded, feeling a sense of finality. It wasn't about revenge anymore, but about accountability. Her destructive behavior had been a symptom of a deeper corruption, and now the entire disease was being rooted out. Later, as the party began to wind down and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Elena and I stood alone inside the greenhouse. She ran her hand along the smooth, cool aluminum frame. Her orchids were already in their new home, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the memory of the destruction. "It's more beautiful than the first one," she said, her voice soft. "It is," I agreed. "It's built stronger." But we both knew I wasn't talking about the frame or the glass. The true change wasn't the new structure in our backyard, but the new structure of our community. The HOA, under Frank and George's leadership, had been completely reformed. They had hired a professional, third-party management company to handle the day-to-day finances, ensuring transparency and preventing any single person from having unilateral control. They had rewritten the bylaws, clarifying the rules and adding robust checks and balances to prevent the abuse of power. The ARC, the Architectural Review Committee, was now composed of a rotating panel of 5 homeowners, ensuring no single person could act as a gatekeeper. The spirit of the neighborhood had transformed. People were friendlier, more engaged. The fear and apathy that had allowed Karen's tyranny to flourish had been replaced by a sense of shared ownership and vigilance. People stopped to chat while walking their dogs. They organized block parties. They looked out for one another. The ordeal had forged them into a real community. As I stood there with my arm around my wife, watching the last rays of sunlight sparkle through the glass, I thought about the journey. It began with a violent, shocking act of destruction born from one woman's petty need for power. It had dragged us through a mire of bureaucratic nonsense, legal threats, and public humiliation. But through it all, we held the line. We gathered our intelligence, built our alliances, and chose our moment to strike. We used the system's own rules to dismantle it and rebuild it from the ground up. The victory wasn't just the $58,000 check or the sight of Karen's moving truck. The victory was this moment, standing in a place of peace and growth, surrounded by a community that had found its voice, with the woman I loved, whose therapeutic sanctuary was finally truly safe. Karen had wanted to teach me that violations have consequences, and in the end, she was right. Her own violations of trust, decency, and the law had brought upon her the most severe consequences of all, the complete and utter loss of everything she had sought to control. We had taken her battlefield, a place of conflict and destruction, and turned it into a garden. And in a garden, the only things that grow are the things you nurture.